It's a pleasure and an honor for me to introduce the first speaker, not speaker, but this is Mr. Jean Hilgers, who is the chair of the board of the Université catholique de Louvain, le président du conseil d'administration de l'UCL, qui va introduire la séance aujourd'hui. Je lui cède la parole, Monsieur Jean Hilgers. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Jean-Pascal. Mr. President, Professor Oreskes, colleagues and guests, dear students, good morning to you all. Very happy to express a few words as an introduction of today's conference. First, I'd like to thank you very warmly, Professor Oreskes, for your presence among us today. I think this is the starting point of your European tour for presentation of the French translation of your book, Les Marchands du Doute, Merchants of Doubt, here in Louvain-la-Neuve, in our university. And your book is indeed a deep, serious scientific work. It's the work of an historian. But it's clear that you have really spent a lot of time about indeed analysis of the interviews you conducted, data, archives you gathered, about the attack of the science of global warming and the role of a handful of powerful people, obviously, and companies to cast some doubts on the results of scientific research in this area, obviously for commercial reasons. And this is something we'd like so much in this university, a deep, serious scientific work based on an attentive analysis of different sources in order to understand this specific phenomenon. And your book shows all your capacity of treating a subject using different fields and different disciplines, presented by some as controversial, but anyway, to us, you do it with an outstanding rigor, based on evidence, on facts, and on clear relationship between them. Your book is also a good illustration of a real interdisciplinary approach. Different scientific disciplines, such as climatology, earth science, political and economic science, history, communication studies, among others, involved in your work. And this is in tune, I think, with the core business of this university, which is basically at the cross-discipline level. UCL is a complete university, has a vocation of being one. And we focus a lot of resources to the development of cross-discipline research and education. So we feel very at home with the way you conducted your research. And I think that your work is also important because climatic change threatens the very habitability of our planet. And your results should be brought, and that's basically what your presence here is all about, to be brought to the European public as a whole, but also to the decision makers. Some of them are here today. And you know that Brussels is second place in terms of lobbying in public affairs after Washington. So if one day, after your tour, you'd like to come home here at our university to conduct some research, based on different people, we can provide you with different themes and different disciplines, so as to be able to compare your US findings with European ones, and then submit it to the European Commission, then feel free. We would be happy to welcome and to house your research. But anyway, Professor Oreskes, I will now give the floor to Jean-Pascal Van Ypersele, who with Professor Thierry Libaert have collaborated to introduce this conference. Thank you for this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, because you rearranged your schedule this morning to allow your presence here, and this is very appreciated. I'd like now to introduce my colleague, Professor Thierry Libaert, from the LASCO, the Laboratoire d'analyse des systèmes de communication des organisations, who was my accomplice to organize this. Thierry.
Dear Professor Oreskes, as President of the Laboratory for the Analysis of Organizational Communication in UCL, I take great pleasure in introducing you to this conference. Your book, Professor, represents a real contribution to the understanding of a specific and important communication field, climate change communication. Your book is not in communication studies, but communication studies have a lot to learn of your work. We often think that climate skepticism is the result of lobbying action financed by big business, particularly from the energy sector. You show that it is quite more complex and that there is an important ideological and political aspect. And some major actors in denial campaigns are motivated by ideological position with the arguments, unquote, all kinds of economic regulation are bad in principle and not reconcilable with our freedom. Politics and ideology is deeply involved in this story. Your book also enriches our knowledge on climate skeptic discourses. Our researches show that climate skeptics show themselves as a resistant minority against the menacing power, the nebula of big international organizations and official science, sort of a new David against an evil Goliath. Likewise, climate skeptics consider themselves as the real free people in the debate, fighting against what they portray as the real lobby, represented by the IPCC members, who try to create alarmism in order to do some fundraising for their laboratory. In consequence, they see and portray themselves as the real science. Finally, they use the happiness argument. Climate skeptics declare that they are on the side of optimism. They believe in human nature and technical advancement. They are open to the future, in opposition to the catastrophic, doom, pessimist, and depressing climatologists. And they question our responsibility and the media responsibility. It's a question of the debate, and the answer is not so easy. If 98% of climate scientists agree on human responsibility on climate change, do we have to go eternally in dialogue with the risk of giving them credibility and legitimacy to denial positions? Because they are often better in debates than scientists. And on the contrary, if we refuse, they will argue against censorship, position themselves as victims, and the result will be the reinforcement of their position. So, Professor Oreskes, you raise a lot of very interesting questions, and we will be very happy to learn from you. Thank you. Jean-Pascal.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, dear Naomi, these are the books that Thierry has mentioned. This is the American edition, and this is the we just came out of the press, the French edition, which I think a bookshop is going to sell at the end of the conference, if you wish. There is doubt in the title of this conference. And Naomi Oreskes is going to speak about the merchants of doubt. Well, I'm going to instill some doubt in you, if you allow me for a second. I'm not going to read the very long curriculum vitae of Naomi. I'm going to instill some doubt. I mean, after all, this is the subject, isn't it? No. Naomi Oreskes is not only the author of this book. She is not only a historian of science and teaching history of science and several other connected subjects at the University of California in San Diego. She is a geologist also. I was very surprised to read that. Actually, she has a BA for Imperial College in London in geology. Not only that, but obtained with first-class honors. So this is not only a historian. She also, is connected to one of the many sciences, as the chair of the board mentioned, who helped over the last 30, 40 years, climatology, modern climate science, to become what it became. So I'm not going to make a long talk here. The vita of Naomi Oreskes is on our website. I think the key reason you came here is to listen to her. So I think it's important now that I give the floor to her. Just let me mention that she received last year the Climate Change Communicator Prize for the first time in the history of that prize, I believe, and I'm sure you will understand why, if and only if, Naomi, you don't speak too fast. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Hold on, I need to fix this here. Okay, that's better. Thank you so much. It's an honor, a great honor to be here today. Thank you so much to everyone who has helped to organize this, and to the chairman and everyone, and to all of you for coming today. I will try to speak slowly, but what Jean-Pascal did not tell you, the most important thing is that I am also originally from New York City, so it makes it very difficult to speak slowly. But I shall do my best. In 2005, my Austrian governor announced that the state of California would commit itself to Kyoto-level reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And when he made this announcement, he said, and I will not attempt an Austrian accent, "I say the debate is over. We know the science, we see the threat, and we know the time for action is now." Now, as a historian of science, I was very impressed that my governor understood the science so well. And indeed, it seemed at that time in the United States, the American people had received the message about the reality of climate change. In a major public opinion poll released in 2007, 72% of Americans were completely or mostly convinced that global warming was underway. 62% of American citizens believed that life on Earth would continue without major disruptions only if society took immediate and drastic action to reduce global warming. And indeed, at that time, even many former climate skeptics had come around. One of these was a man named Frank Luntz, who is famous in the United States, some might say infamous, as a Republican strategist. In 2006, in an interview, he said, "It's now 2006. So he had got off to a good start. He got the year correct. I think most people would conclude that there is global warming taking place and that the behavior of humans is affecting the climate. Now, Luntz is important for our history because he was the author of a memorandum written in 2003 for Republican candidates running for office in the United States, in which he advised those candidates not to talk about global warming, but to talk about climate change instead. And the reason, he argued, is that climate change is a lot less frightening than global warming. He also advised Republican candidates to insist that there was no scientific consensus on this question. And he wrote, "The scientific debate remains open. Voters believe that there is no consensus about global warming within the scientific community. Should the public come to believe that the scientific issues are settled, their views about global warming will change accordingly. Therefore, you need to continue to make the lack of scientific certainty a primary issue in the debate." So here we see the doubt-mongering strategy in a nutshell, written down in black and white. Now, as a historian of science, I was very struck by this because I knew that Luntz's position was not factually correct. The scientific debate was not still open. In 2001, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change had written in their report that human activities are modifying the concentration of atmospheric constituents that absorb or scatter radiant energy. Most of the observed warming over the last 50 years is likely to have been due to the increase in greenhouse gas concentrations. Moreover, the science had in fact actually coalesced, excuse me, even earlier. As early as 1995, in the second assessment report, the IPCC had concluded that the balance of scientific evidence suggests a discernible human impact on global climate. Thank you. Now, in my own work, I had been interested in the question of whether or not the IPCC, with all due respect to Jean-Pascal, whether or not the IPCC was in fact accurately reflecting the views of the rank and file of the scientific community. And so I did an analysis of peer-reviewed scientific literature to test the question of whether this declaration and those of the various scientific societies were consistent with the published scientific literature. And the answer I found was yes. Now, when I published this work in 2004, this result surprised many people. In fact, many people said, well, we know there's a debate, so if you can't find it, you must be an idiot. But really, this should not have been a surprising result. Because as you all know, although many Americans seem to have forgotten, the United States is a signatory to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, adopted in 1992. And when our first President Bush, President George H.W. Bush, signed the UN Framework Convention, he called on world leaders to translate the written document into concrete action to protect the planet. So I became interested in the question, what happened? Why didn't we take those concrete steps? And why did the United States reject not only the UN framework, the legal and political framework, but as well the science upon which it was based? So what I'd like to do here today is give you a very, very brief history of the evolution of climate science, and then tell you the story of the emergence of a political challenge to that science. It's a story of selling uncertainty to stave off government regulation and to protect free market capitalism, or at least to protect an idealized image of it. So our story begins in the 19th century with the work of John Tyndall, who first established what it meant for something to be a greenhouse gas. In a series of experiments in the 1860s, Tyndall showed that carbon dioxide has the distinctive property of being highly transparent to visible light, but relatively opaque to infrared radiation. So heat from the sun, light from the sun comes in, but heat from the earth is trapped. So it's a heat-trapping gas. And we have known this about carbon dioxide since the middle of the 19th century. Now, a few years later, around the turn of the century, the Swedish geochemist Svante Arrhenius realized that when people burned coal to warm their houses, that combustion of coal produces carbon dioxide. And that carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere, where it had the potential to change the climate of the Earth. Arrhenius did the first quantitative assessment of what the effect of doubling carbon dioxide in the atmosphere could be, and calculated that it would change the average temperature of the globe, increase the average temperature of the globe by 1.5 to 4.5 degrees centigrade. Now, Arrhenius was Swedish, so he thought that global warming would be a good thing. The first person to suggest that it might not be a good thing, or it might be too much of a good thing, was the British steam engineer Guy Stewart Callender. In the 1930s, he published the first scientific article suggesting that an increase in carbon dioxide was already underway, and that temperature might be increasing as well. Now, that was in the late 1930s. In the 1940s, Europe got distracted by a little diversion known as World War II. And it wasn't really until the 1950s that scientists came back to the question in a vigorous way. And among the scientists who did were these two men, Hans Suess, a German geochemist by birth who moved to the United States, and his colleague in California, Roger Revelle. In 1957, as part of the preparation for the International Geophysical Year, Revelle and Suess proposed that scientists should begin to monitor carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in order to test the Arrhenius hypothesis, to test whether or not the climate was indeed changing as predicted. And in this paper, they argued that mankind was performing a great geophysical experiment by returning to the atmosphere carbon dioxide that had been stored in rocks for hundreds of millions of years of geological time. This work was also made at the same time by Bert Bolin in Sweden, who later would work on the long-range transport of air pollution conventions and helped to found the IPCC. Now, there was one very important scientific uncertainty at that time which got a lot of discussion, and this was the competing effect of water vapor. Since Tyndall had also shown that water vapor was a greenhouse gas, and it was well known that there was far more water vapor in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. So some people argued that because there was so much more water vapor, that CO2 would have relatively little effect. After all, it's a very minor component of the atmosphere, at that time only about 300 parts per million. This issue was taken up by the spectroscopist Gilbert Plass, who did the first analyses of satellite data of absorption of heat in the upper atmosphere, and he was able to show that although there is far more water in the atmosphere than CO2, that CO2 absorbs heat in a distinctive absorption band, and that therefore the addition of additional CO2 would in fact have an impact. It would not be overwhelmed by the effect of water vapor. So given this work, in 1958, Charles David Keeling began the systematic study of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Within a few years, he had begun to produce what we now know as the Keeling curve, for which he later won the US National Medal of Science. By 1965, Dave Keeling had concluded that his own data showed that indeed you could measure the increase in carbon dioxide. This graph shows both the annual fluctuation associated with winter and spring, but also the steady, slow increase in carbon dioxide caused by burning fossil fuels. By 1965, this work was already receiving attention in policy circles, including the US President's Science Advisory Committee. And in a report written to President Lyndon Johnson, Revelle and Keeling wrote, by the year 2000, there will be about 25% more CO2 in our atmosphere than at present, and this will modify the heat balance of the atmosphere to such an extent that marked changes in climate could occur. So we see that as early as 1965, scientists understood carbon dioxide was increasing and predicted, in hindsight we could say, in fact, accurately predicted what the consequences of that would be. And not only did the scientists say this, but the President of the United States heard it. And in a special message to Congress, President Lyndon Johnson said, "This generation has altered the composition of the atmosphere on a global scale through a steady increase in carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels." So that was in 1965, when the Keeling curve only looked like that. Now, in the 1970s saw the rise of numerical simulation modeling using advanced computers, and there began to emerge a strong consensus among scientific experts, including Steve Schneider, who I understand you had here as a visitor recently before his death, that given this rise of carbon dioxide that Keeling had documented, had measured, that sooner or later global warming would be inevitable. Various reports then began to be written at this time suggesting the need for attention and concern, that this was both a scientific and a political or policy issue. There were many different reports, but a few of the more important ones included the World Meteorological Organization's statement on climatic change in 1976, and a National Research Council study group on carbon dioxide, sometimes known in the United States as the Charney Report. These various diverse reports in Europe and the United States were summarized by the US National Academy of Sciences in 1979, who wrote, "A plethora of studies from diverse sources indicates a consensus that climate changes will result from man's combustion of fossil fuels and changes in land use." So there was a consensus that climate change was to be expected, but what there was not yet a consensus about was when. How soon would any of these changes begin to occur? Most scientists writing on the question in the 1970s thought that will result meant by the year 2000, or perhaps even later. One scientist I interviewed told the story of going to the Carter White House, the White House under President Jimmy Carter, and giving a briefing on this question. This is in 1979, and one official asked the question, well, when will these changes occur? And he said, maybe in 40 years, and the official said, please come back in 39. So the surprise in this story was only 6 years later, when NASA climate modeler Jim Hansen and his team concluded that climate change was actually already underway. In a series of published scientific papers, and also in testimony to the US Congress, Jim Hansen declared that he was 99% certain that climate change was happening. was now detectable. That same year, of course, also saw the creation of the IPCC to assess, evaluate, and understand the scientific basis. In the United States, it led to the introduction in Congress of the U.S. National Energy Policy Act to establish a national energy policy to reduce the generation of carbon dioxide and trace gases as quickly as is feasible in order to slow the pace and degree of atmospheric warming. Needless to say, that law did not pass. And it led the New York Times to say in August of 1988 that the issue of an overheating world has suddenly moved to the forefront of public concern. So we see then, to summarize, that scientists had predicted that burning fossil fuels would change the climate, and by the late 1980s that prediction was starting to come true, and world leaders were starting to pay attention. But at the same time as the scientific predictions were coming true, at the same time as a scientific and political consensus was beginning to emerge, so too was a politically motivated campaign to cast doubt upon that science. The campaign focused on the claim that the science was not settled, that there was not a consensus, that we didn't really know, and therefore it would be premature to act. As a historian, I'm interested in origins. I'm interested in where things come from and how we have got to the place that we are. And what my colleague Eric Conway and I found by tracing this story back to the 1980s was that the origins of this claim, this doubt-mongering claim that the science isn't really settled, that we don't really know, can be traced back to a startlingly small number of people. Now today, as you all know, there are attacks on climate science from many quarters. But one of the most important, going back to the late 1980s, is a think tank in Washington, D.C. called the George C. Marshall Institute. Since the late 1980s, the Marshall Institute has either denied the reality of global warming or insisted that if there is warming, it is not caused by human activities. Just to give you one example, the Institute has quoted Timothy Ball, a Canadian geographer, who says that the widely propagated fact that humans are contributing to global warming is the greatest deception in the history of science. As far as I know, he's never taken a course in history of science. I invite him to come to my university and study with me. So where did the Marshall Institute come from? Why do they promote doubt about climate science, going so far even as to suggest that it is a hoax? The Marshall Institute was founded by three men, all physicists who had built their careers in the Cold War, working on Cold War weapons and rocketry programs for the United States government. On the left, Robert Jastrow, an astrophysicist who had been an early proponent of the space program. On the right, William Nierenberg, a nuclear physicist who had worked on the atomic bomb, working on isotope separation for the original uranium bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. And in the center, Frederick Seitz, a solid-state physicist who had worked with Eugene Wigner, worked on the hydrogen bomb, and later became president of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. All three were brilliant physicists. All three had worked on politically crucial scientific problems, and all three had risen to positions of very great influence and stature in the United States, and actually in Europe as well. Nierenberg served as science advisor to NATO, positions of power and influence because of what they had done scientifically during World War II and the Cold War. Not one was a climate scientist. These men had served on many scientific advisory panels together, and in the early 1980s, they found themselves working together on an advisory panel to the Reagan administration, to President Ronald Reagan, on the question of the Strategic Defense Initiative, the idea of a missile shield to defend the United States from incoming Soviet missiles. In 1984, they created the Marshall Institute to support and defend the Strategic Defense Initiative against a scientist boycott. Now, SDI, strategic defense, was controversial for many reasons, but particularly because it was a departure from the long-established Cold War doctrine of mutual assured destruction. And as a result of this, a very large number of American scientists, over 6,500 American scientists and engineers, opposed the project and signed a petition saying that they would not work on SDI because it would be destabilizing and could lead to a third world war. Against this enormous outpouring of opposition from their scientific colleagues, Jastrow, Seitz, and Nirenberg defended SDI, insisting that it was not only feasible, but that it was necessary and urgent to protect the United States from the Soviet threat. For the next 5 years, Jastrow, Seitz, and Nirenberg worked to defend SDI by promoting an alarming view of Soviet strength and a frightening picture of American weakness. I don't have time to talk about all the different activities they participated in, but they wrote articles, letters to editors, they communicated with editors of newspapers to get their views across, and they published a number of articles. This one is my favorite. In 1987, Robert Jastrow published the article, "America Has 5 Years Left." Now, at the same time, Friedrich Seitz had retired from his position as president of the Rockefeller University and had taken on another job in his retirement years, working as a consultant to the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Corporation. As many of you know, and we explain in the first chapter of our book, the principal strategy that the tobacco industry used to defend its product was doubt-mongering, to insist that the science was unsettled, that we didn't really know if tobacco was harmful, and therefore it would be inappropriate and premature for the government to try to control or regulate tobacco use. In 1989, these two different stories, tobacco on the one hand, nuclear weapons on the other, came together. The Berlin Wall came down, the Soviet Union began to break apart, the Cold War came to a rather abrupt end. So we might have thought that these physicists would have been happy, that the West had won the Cold War, that democracy and capitalism had triumphed. And given their age, given that all of them were now at least in their 60s or 70s, we might have expected them to retire, but they didn't. Instead, they found a new enemy, a new threat, a new set of reds under the bed. And this threat was what they called environmental extremism, what they considered to be the exaggeration of environmental threats by people with a left-wing agenda. And drawing on the experience that Friedrich Seitz had had working with the tobacco industry, they applied the tobacco strategy to insist that the science was unsettled. "Doubt is our product," ran the infamous memo written by one tobacco industry executive in 1969, "since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the minds of the general public." And I'd like to remind people that this memo and millions of documents in supporting evidence were the basis for the prosecution of the tobacco industry in the United States by the US Department of Justice for criminal conspiracy to commit fraud. So we know, it is factually documented, that the tobacco industry engaged in a criminal conspiracy centered around this idea of doubt as their product. But one of the things that the tobacco industry understood from the very beginning was that for doubt to be credible, it couldn't just be tobacco industry executives supplying the doubt. It had to be credible experts. And this is where scientists came in. The tobacco industry understood that they needed scientists to supply the doubt. And so they began to recruit scientists like Friedrich Seitz and others. And then these same scientists, as we show in our book, went on to supply doubt not just about the harms of tobacco, but over a whole set of issues, including the threat of nuclear winter, the reality and causes of acid precipitation, the severity and significance of the ozone hole, and now, today, the reality and human causes of global warming. Some of them have also been involved in a campaign to try to resurrect the pesticide DDT and claim that there was no good scientific evidence for its being banned in the United States. The physicists who we tell about in our story cast doubt on all of these issues, way beyond their expertise in physics, into areas in which they had never done any original scientific research. And in every single case, in time and time and time again, they insisted that the science was too uncertain to justify government action. Now, to learn how they do it, you'll need to buy the book. But I'd like to give you some indication of some of the strategies, many of which will be familiar to you, but I think it's worth spending a minute to just emphasize how egregiously false many of their claims are. So as I've said, the central strategy, the unifying theme, is to sow doubt by casting doubt on the science and creating the impression of authentic scientific debate. They do this by raising questions about the data, by making claims that are at odds with established scientific conclusions, by making those claims repeatedly, and by making them in a manner that appears to be scientific. Some examples. So many of you have heard the claim that there is no warming, or that the warming has stopped. This is a claim we've heard in the United States for more than 20 years. It is simply untrue. Here is a recent graph that was published just a few weeks ago that summarizes 4 different entirely independent analyses, 2 in the United States from NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, the other from NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, the blue line from the Hadley Center, Climate Research Unit in the United Kingdom, and then a new analysis from a group of physicists, formerly skeptical physicists, at the University of California in Berkeley. These 4 different independent analyses all show the same pattern. There is no disagreement among the data or among the scientists who have analyzed it, and as you see clearly, the key point is the behavior of the Earth's climate system in the last 50 years, roughly 40 to 50 years, where we see a steady increase, a steady and rapid increase. Recently, we've heard the claim that the warming has stopped, and as you see clearly from this graph, there are ups and downs of climate, as we all know. There is no evidence that the warming has stopped. A second popular claim is that the warming is caused by the sun, that this is not the result of human activities, it's simply a natural phenomenon caused by increased solar radiation. This claim was first made by the Marshall Institute in the late 1980s, and it's one of the clearest examples of how they actually misrepresent scientific data. So here is a graph that was published by the Marshall Institute based on the work that James Hansen and his team had done. And what they do here in this graph, is there a pointer available by any chance? No? Okay. Well, you can see, it's clear enough. So the upper line, the jagged irregular line, are actual temperature records going back to the year 1880. The lower line is the predicted warming if the warming were being driven only by carbon dioxide. And in this report they say, well, you can see that there's a pretty big difference between these 2 graphs. In particular, the actual temperature increase, goes up a lot in the 1940s, then it comes back down in the 60s, goes back up and again in the 80s. And so you can see that these 2 graphs do not match, and therefore the increased carbon dioxide cannot be the cause of the warming. This is what they argue in the report. But now let's look at where that data actually came from. These data were not produced by the scientists at the Marshall Institute. They were produced by James Hansen at NASA. Oh my goodness, now I'm really in charge. Okay. Walk tall and carry a big stick, right? So on the right is the actual scientific paper published by Jim Hansen and his team. And what they were doing in that team is they were asking the question, we know that many things can affect the climate. We know the sun can affect the climate. We know volcanoes can affect the climate. We know greenhouse gases can affect the climate. What combination of factors best explains the actual temperature record? And what you see here is that in their modeling, the lower right-hand corner is the best match to the data. And what Hansen and his team were arguing is that the actual observed temperature record can be fully explained and understood by a combination of natural variation in solar radiation, some cooling effect from volcanic eruptions, and a warming effect from carbon dioxide. So all 3 of these things together explain what we've seen. But the Marshall Institute take these data completely out of context and use them to argue the opposite of what, in fact, Hansen and his team had concluded. Now, a second claim that is sometimes made is that carbon dioxide doesn't matter because there's so little of it in the atmosphere. 300 parts per million, 350, what is that? And there's so much more water vapor. How can such a tiny amount of carbon dioxide have any impact? Well, earlier I showed you this graph. Sometimes when I give this talk, people wonder, why do we need to spend so much time worrying about Gilbert Plas and this rather obscure work from the 1950s? Well, this is why. Because this question of the impact of carbon dioxide and why a small amount of carbon dioxide can make a big difference was answered in the 1950s, more than 60 years ago. So this is another strategy to take some old scientific work that's well established, well known, well understood, but that most of us have never heard of because it was done so long ago, and to resurrect this as if it were a legitimate scientific question. Another strategy is to claim that there simply isn't any consensus. This is a very easy strategy because all it takes is for one person, like Patrick Michaels, who works at the Cato Institute, to get up in public and say, well, I don't agree, so therefore there's obviously no consensus. Well, this is my favorite one because I did the work that analyzed the scientific literature. A scientific consensus is not about what journalists say. It's not about what politicians say. It's not about what a paid person at the Cato Institute says. It's about what's published in the peer-reviewed scientific literature. And this is what I analyzed in my own work, and it makes me tired and depressed to realize that it's nearly 10 years ago that I did this work. We have known for a long time that the scientific community was in agreement about the reality of anthropogenic global warming. This is one of my favorites because it brings me back to my days as a geologist. Even if carbon dioxide has risen, even if it's causing warming, it's not from us, it's from volcanoes. I love volcanoes. You can use volcanoes to explain just about anything. The exact argument was made in the debate over acid rain, that the sulfur in acid rain wasn't coming from burning coal, it was coming from volcanoes. Well, here I get to go back to my own scientific roots. When I was a geologist, I used carbon isotopes to analyze rocks. All of you have heard of carbon-14, which is used, it's a radioactive isotope. It can be used to date things like archaeological remnants, but there's also a stable isotope of carbon, carbon-13, which is preferentially concentrated by plants. So when you burn fossil fuels that came from plants or other organic matter, it releases this carbon-13, it's the opposite. Plants selectively take carbon-12, they don't like carbon-13, so when you burn fossil fuels, the amount of carbon-12 in the atmosphere is increased, the carbon-13 drops. And so this was analyzed in the early 2000s by two scientists who showed here's the carbon-13 in the upper graph, here's the Keeling curve, but now extrapolated back through the ice cores, so we now know that before industrialization, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was about 280 parts per million. And as the carbon dioxide begins to rise, the carbon-13 in a virtual mirror image begins to fall. And this is proof positive that this cannot be caused by volcanoes because volcanoes have a very different carbon-13 signature. So this is a kind of fingerprint of organic sources such as fossil fuels. So what we see here is that there is overwhelming scientific evidence documented in the peer-reviewed literature, summarized and assessed by the IPCC, and affirmed by every major scientific society in the world. We know from scientific work for more than 100 years now that there is warming, that the warming has not stopped, that it cannot be explained by natural variability alone, and it is consistent with what was predicted by Arrhenius, Callendar, Platz, Bolin, Suess, Revel, and many others on the basis of physics, chemistry, and thermodynamics, science that is more than 60 years old, science that is very well established. And the carbon dioxide does not come from volcanoes. The contrarian claims are, in fact, the opposite of what scientific evidence tells us. The French minister Clemenceau, when asked in the 1920s what historians would say about World War I, responded, "This I do not know, but they will not say that Belgium invaded Germany." Contrarian claims about climate change are not skeptical. They are not healthy scientific debate. They are the scientific equivalent of claiming that Belgium invaded Germany. Now, I've just been in Germany, and I'm happy to report that Germans do not routinely say that Belgium invaded them. So why do Americans deny the reality of global warming? Well, there are many reasons. This is a complex political, economic, and ideological story. But one of the most important reasons is the ideological component. And the answer is provided most clearly by a fourth physicist in our story, a man by the name of Fred Singer, who, like the others, was also a Cold War physicist, in fact, a rocket scientist. And like the others, he was involved in campaigns to challenge the evidence of acid rain, ozone hole, and global warming. And like the others, he also worked for the tobacco industry. In the early 1990s, Fred Singer attacked the US Environmental Protection Agency over secondhand smoke, working in conjunction with the Philip Morris Tobacco Company. In 1993, he published a report entitled EPA, that's the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Science of Environmental Tobacco Smoke. Now, Singer had been working with colleagues at the Marshall Institute on acid rain and the ozone hole. Jeffries was a lawyer affiliated with the Cato Institute and also the Competitive Enterprise Institute, best known for his advocacy of privatization of the commons. He once wrote an article arguing for the privatization of the ocean. The report was published by yet another think tank, a group named the Alexis de Tocqueville Institute, and I'll say more about these in a moment. And the money for this report came from the tobacco industry, funneled through a group called the Tobacco Institute, which were the research and lobbying arm of the tobacco industry. So here you begin to see the money comes from the tobacco industry, it's given to the Tobacco Institute, who gives it to the de Tocqueville Institute, who gives it to Fred Singer to write a report attacking the Environmental Protection Agency. Now, why was the Environmental Protection Agency the target of this attack? Well, the EPA had declared secondhand or passive smoke to be a Class A, or proven carcinogen. This result was affirmed by the US Surgeon General, and an independent peer review panel concluded that secondhand smoke was responsible for over 3,000 adult lung cancer deaths every year in the United States alone, many more in Europe and elsewhere, and between 150 and 300,000 additional cases of bronchitis and pneumonia in infants and young children. They also concluded that there was a statistically significant correlation with sudden infant death syndrome. So the scientific evidence was supported by diverse independent studies, over 6,000 studies in the United States, Europe, Japan, Australia, and Canada. So why would a physicist challenge this biological and medical evidence? Well, we don't have to speculate because Fred Singer told us in his own words. He wrote, "If we do not carefully delineate the government's role in regulating dangers, there is essentially no limit to how much government can ultimately control our lives." This is but one example. If you read the book, you will see there are many more. And in each example, what we see over and over and over again is that these debates were not about the science. They were about governance. They were about regulation and the appropriate role of government in the marketplace and in our lives. They were a continuation of the Cold War defense of capitalism against communism, but persisting long after the Cold War was over. And indeed, in the book we show that throughout their writings, contrarians assert that environmentalists, and by implications the scientists working on environmental issues, have a hidden political agenda. And that agenda is socialist. They accuse environmentalists of being watermelons, green on the outside and red on the inside. George Will, who writes for the respected newspaper, The Washington Post, has called environmentalism a green tree with red roots. Senator James Inhofe, who has threatened to indict climate scientists for conspiracy to lie to Congress, has called global warming a conspiracy to bring down global capitalism, to which I respond that scientists should be so organized. And the Viscount Monckton, formerly connected to the Margaret Thatcher administration in the United Kingdom, has called environmentalists greens too yellow to admit that they are red. Fred Singer, when he attacked the Nobel laureate Sherry Rowland over the scientific evidence of the ozone hole, wrote, "And then there are those with hidden agendas of their own." I love that line, hidden agendas of their own, essentially admitting that he has a hidden agenda, not just to save the environment, but to change our economic system. Some of these coercive utopians are socialists, some are technology-hating Luddites, most have a great desire to regulate on as large a scale as possible. And he continued, "More dangerous are those who have a hidden political agenda, most often oriented against business, the free market, and the capitalistic system." Of course, after the collapse of socialism, it is no longer fashionable to argue for state ownership of industrial concerns. The alternative is to control private firms by regulating every step of the manufacturing process. So you see this argument that regulation is just a substitute for a command and control economy. More recently, the same issue was taken up by presidential candidates in the United States, when Republican candidate Mitt Romney broke with many in his party and said that he believed humans had contributed to global warming, a position he's since backed off. Former Speaker of the House of Representatives Newt Gingrich said that the push to address climate is simply the newest excuse to take control of our lives. And this then begins to explain the larger political and ideological aspect of this story, the way in which this story grew from 3 physicists in Washington, D.C., to what it is today, a whole network of think tanks, and I have a long list of them here, a whole network of think tanks and foundations who challenge the scientific evidence of anthropogenic climate change. If we ask what all of these different groups have in common, they all promote laissez-faire economics. They all promote free market solutions to social and environmental problems. They all believe in the so-called magic of the marketplace. And they all take their inspiration from 2 key thinkers. Milton Friedman, the Chicago economist, who in 1962, at the very coldest moment of the Cold War, published an influential book called Capitalism and Freedom, in which he argued that civic and political freedom are inextricably linked, because once governments begin to control the marketplace, it's only a matter of time before they will begin to control us as individuals as well. Friedman took his own inspiration from someone that most Americans have never heard of, but people in Europe have, Friedrich von Hayek, the Austrian, one of the founders of neoliberal economics. His influential 1944 book, written during World War II, The Road to Serfdom, laid out an argument against not only communism, but also even for Western European-style social democracy, fearing that social democracy would put us on a slippery slope to serfdom, which would then be a slippery slope to socialism, which he called the road to serfdom. George Soros has referred to this nexus of beliefs as free market fundamentalism, a kind of faith, an unabiding faith that markets can solve all of our problems. And moreover, therefore, that any attempt to intervene in the marketplace, even for a good cause like protecting infants and children from the harms of secondhand smoke, will end up in the long run being counterproductive. The contrarians and climate skeptics take this argument even further, arguing that environmentalism is the road to serfdom. Why? Well, because environmentalists generally do argue for some kind of government intervention, and from regulation of acid rain or secondhand smoke, it is only a small step towards government control more broadly. This is also why they hate the IPCC, because global governance is even more threatening than national governance. Now, there are many problems with this argument, but the problem that, as a historian, I like to point out is that it's simply refuted by the facts of history. First of all, von Hayek was wrong about the road to serfdom. As you all know, after World War II, most Western European governments adopted some degree of social democracy, and they all became more democratic than they had been before World War II. And Milton Friedman was wrong about the inextricable link between capitalism and freedom. Capitalism and freedom have often gone hand in hand, it's certainly true, but by no means inextricably. In the United Kingdom, where capitalism was invented, in the 19th century, skilled workers were prohibited from emigrating, while petty criminals were forced to be transported to Australia. In the United States, one need only think about the long history of slavery, hardly freedom for those who were the victims of it. Or Chile in the 1970s, when a democratically elected socialist president, Salvador Allende, was overthrown and replaced by a capitalist dictatorship. Or in China today, where there's a new emerging form of economy that economists have had to come up with a new term to describe. They call it market authoritarianism, increasingly market-based and yet without the political and civic freedoms that we'd like to think would go with markets. Moreover, as most of us also realize, markets do fail. Free market capitalism, like any human system, has its limitations. We've certainly seen some of them in the last few years. We saw them during the Great Depression. But the one that's most important for us to consider here in the context of climate change is what our economic colleagues call negative externalities, costs that accrue to people who did not reap the benefits of those goods and services, costs that are not reflected in the market price. And this is the common thread that unites all the diverse challenges that the merchants of doubt challenged, from tobacco to nuclear winter to climate change, well outside their scientific expertise. So if you ask the question, what unites all of these different issues, the answer is they were all market failures. They were all activities that were generating substantial external costs and therefore provided a potential warrant for government intervention in the marketplace. And this is why Nicholas Stern, the former chief economist of the World Bank, has called anthropogenic global warming the greatest and widest ranging market failure ever seen. Because the price we pay for energy does not reflect the external costs, the damage that those fossil fuels do to the environment and the climate. But here's the interesting thing. If we ask ourselves the question, how did we learn about these market failures? How did we come to realize that the market was failing us? The answer is not from economists, but from scientists, from men like Dave Keeling and Jim Hansen and Roger Revelle and the IPCC. It was science that revealed these market failures, and therefore science that became the target. For after all, if the science were wrong, if we didn't have climate change and acid rain in the ozone hole, then it would mean that laissez-faire capitalism had not failed us, and intervention was not needed. Capitalism would have triumphed not only in the Cold War, it would have triumphed over the very notion of human limits. So to conclude, the Industrial Revolution brought the developed world 150 years of unprecedented prosperity. And prosperity is a good thing. But it turns out there is a bill. Acid rain, ozone depletion, and disruptive climate change are all part of that bill. And that is a bill that has now come due. And as the novelist Kim Stanley Robinson has acutely pointed out, the invisible hand never picks up the check. Thank you very much.